Yes, everyone. I know it. I'm ready. I'm late. I'm running late. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. I know that I'm gonna have to do a lot to earn your forgiveness, but here we are. I'm ready. Today we're going to be looking at a video by Alex O'Connor. I know. And well, actually, I'm looking at 3 videos from Alex O'Connor, inshallah, because the first one is Bible Studies with Atheist Al. It's always, I feel sorry for people with the name Al because now it just reads like AI. Episode 1 Exodus. I believe, by the way, there is not an episode 2 of the series. Unless I've missed it. You know, actually, let me just have one more look. Hello there, Joking Jingling Jonkler. It's good to have you here. Yeah, let me just check I'm not stupid. Okay, so Bible study. Let's say Alex O'Connor, Bible study. Okay, it's not even the first thing that comes up if you type in Alex O'Connor Bible. In fact, it doesn't. Okay, yeah. So Bible Study with Atheist Al, episode 1, Exodus, and then, I mean, I'll even type in episode 2, just to confirm. Yeah, there is no episode 2. Look, I'm not going to pretend that I've never had a concept of, like, starting a series and then giving up on the series. I don't know. It happens to the best of us, I'm sure. I think it's the thing that happens early on, especially. But that's not a criticism. I'm not, whatever. I'm just saying that that's what I'm looking at. Bible Study of Atheist now, Exodus, and then there's another video which is actually not about the Bible, and there's a final video which is about the Bible. All these videos are very short. Let's jump in, shall we?
Hey everybody, welcome back to Bible Study with me, Atheist Al, your
Let me know how the audio is and things.
secular pal. Today, I thought that we'd look at the book of
Got an ulcer on my tongue.
Exodus, a book of valiant persistence, unwavering
He's so
faith,
young.
and mass genocide. But we'll get.
Oh, someone's gonna come and be like, "Oh, you responded to this video like it was from age ago." Look, I'm just doing it for fun. Whatever. Hey, wait. Okay. Yeah, I do still have audio, don't I? Yeah. It's not like I'm not saying, "Hey, everyone, I'm responding to this video to show that Alex O'Connor, the man, is a terrible, awful person." I mean, for all I know, the arguments in this video will be good. I'm just responding to the video to see because I'm interested in the topic.
That in a bit. So basically, around 400 years after the end of Genesis, the Egyptians have enslaved the people of Israel. In fact, the king of Egypt has issued an order that every firstborn of the Israelites should be cast into the Nile. Now, of course, this didn't come without its protests. Notably, a specific boy was born whose mother loved him so dearly that she tried to hide him for 3 months. But when she couldn't hide him anymore, she instead placed him within the reeds of the River Nile, where he was found, as luck would have it, by the daughter of the Pharaoh, who adopted him and named him Moses. So Moses grew up with a life of luxury. He was, after all, in the family of the Pharaoh. But one day he saw an Egyptian beating up a Hebrew, and being a Hebrew himself, he decided to kill the Egyptian in rage. Now he got kind of scared of the Pharaoh because he'd killed one of his people, so Moses ran away. Now this might seem a little bit confusing at first, because of course this was before the 10 Commandments had been presented, where the idea of not murdering people first showed up. So I mean, it's almost as though the 10
Okay, well, yeah, right. Obviously, the idea of not murdering people is established as something you're not supposed to do right back in the book, the story of Cain and Abel, right? There we go, boom.
Commandments aren't necessary. This might seem confusing.
Yeah, this is also like kind of a stupid argument because obviously it works as an argument against someone who's going to say that before the 10 Commandments, we didn't know morality, but of course Paul says the exact opposite, right? He says that even without the commandments, men are a commandment unto themselves, meaning otherwise we all have an innate sense of morality even if you don't know the law. Everyone knew that murder was wrong. If there was a society where God had never interacted with us directly, never given us a list of laws, anything like that, everyone would still know murder is wrong because we're given an innate sense of morality from our creator. So that's that. But it's still worth having this stuff explicitly codified. So whatever.
But anyway, so Moses ran away in fear, where a bush told him, yeah, you're going to need to go back and save the Israelites from Egyptian rule. And Moses was like, no. And the bush was like, go on. So Moses said, okay, sure, what do I have to do? And the bush said, don't worry, I've got a plan. We're just going to use a good old-fashioned bit of deceit. Now again, luckily this was before the 10 Commandments had been administered, because this directly contradicts one of them. Again, let's not get too...
So I assume this is talking about, don't be a false witness, because obviously... I'm not sure, what is the deceit here? Am I like just being really stupid? I'm not sure exactly what the obvious deceit is supposed to be. Yeah, I'm reading Genesis, and murder warranting death is brought up a couple times. Yeah, I mean, there's even the story about like something about like people's being avenged sevenfold, something like that. Anyway, but yeah, I'm not quite sure what the deceit is, but obviously the thing with the like don't lie. That is, I mean, just as don't kill, right? Don't kill is a general rule, but there are actually many situations where you can kill. There are, I mean, depending on how you're defining stealing, you could say there are situations where you can steal, is, hashtag taxation is theft, blah, blah, blah. And I think, likewise, there are situations where you can lie. So again, this is a question of, are these laws absolute, or are they meant to be interpreted with a recognition that this is not a one of those strict philosophical treatises that's designed to deal with all of the crazy hypotheticals people come up with. No, at the end of the day, there's a degree to which practicality comes into play.
Caught up in the details here. And so, cane in hand, Moses went
Yeah, I'm not actually sure what the deceit is yet.
back to Egypt, went up to the Pharaoh and said, hey, listen, me and my buddies are thinking of going on a bit of a lad's holiday.
Oh, I see. Sorry, how did I not think of this? Yeah, of course. Oh, I feel stupid. Yeah, obviously, so the deceit is that Moses says, oh, we're going to go away, but then we're going to come back. Yeah, it is really interesting, because that, I think, is an aspect that's omitted from a lot of the pop culture retellings of the story of Exodus. I don't think, like, in The Prince of Egypt or even that, Ten Commandments movie, do they show the initial request being, oh, we're just going to go out for a little bit to do a sacrifice, blah, blah, blah. So I never really understood why that specific detail is there. And maybe I'm being completely crazy, but is there not a possibility that okay, here's what it is, right? It's that I think God knew that the Pharaoh was going to refuse the offer. So he makes that. It's basically just to show how unreasonable Pharaoh is, that even when the request is, oh, could you do this small thing for me? And I think, like, I don't know, it's kind of a thing that you do in real life, right? Where if you suspect someone's going to be unreasonable, you maybe start off by asking them for the basic thing. Because if they're not going to offer you the basic thing, well, that kind of answers your question about the bigger thing too.
To the wilderness for 3 days to praise the Lord. Is that cool? And the Pharaoh said, no, you can't do that. Now, why did the Pharaoh refuse them to exit the land of Egypt to praise God? Well, the Bible says it's because God hardened the heart of the Pharaoh, and so he wouldn't let them go.
Not true. So it initially says Pharaoh hardened his own heart, and then later on it says God hardened his heart. With that said, you might be like, well, hold on a minute, Michael. Didn't you just say that God knew Pharaoh wouldn't let them do this, so therefore he's, he did that to expose how unreasonable Pharaoh was, knowing that he wouldn't accept the offer? Doesn't that show that he didn't have free will? No, because I have the ability to predict certain things. And my ability to predict how someone's going to react to something doesn't contradict them having free will. It would be pretty crazy to say that I, a random mortal human being, in knowing that, I don't know, some very selfish person I know is not going to offer me something, that if I ask them, they're not going to offer it. With that said, Pharaoh hardened his own heart. God knew he was going to harden his own heart. And probably, by the way, the reason why God then starts hardening Pharaoh's heart, he starts being the one to do it, when he knows that Pharaoh is when he wants to basically make an example of Pharaoh, the reason why he starts hardening it is because at that point he knows that Pharaoh would start being reasonable and would actually accept it. But of course, by that point, it's too late.
And God's response to this was to punish the Pharaoh with a bunch of plagues for having a hardened heart, which God gave him in the first place. Again, details, not important. And so God proceeded to rain hellfire down on the land of Egypt, but the Pharaoh wouldn't budge. Of course, this was because God kept his heart hardened, even though he was being punished for having a hardened heart.
Yeah, it's just, you really need to understand the fact that initially he hardens his own heart, and I don't know. I think it's about halfway through that God starts hardening his heart. Is basically how it works. So it's 50-50, which is kind of, there's almost like a logic there, right? Of the punishment kind of matches the crime. So the crime is that 5 times, and maybe I'm wrong about it being halfway through he starts hardening Pharaoh's heart, but I think I'm not that wrong. So I'm just going to work on the assumption I'm right. Like 5 times Pharaoh hardens his own heart and doesn't let the Egyptians go. So the punishment for that is that God then hardens his heart 5 times and continues to have these plagues happen.
Look, I didn't write the damn book, or I'm just saying it how it is. So after this went on for a while, God decided, you know what, I've had enough of this. I've had enough of punishing this Pharaoh for something which I'm in control of in the first place. So
this is really interesting music.
he says to Moses, listen up, I've got a plan. I'm going to kill every firstborn in the land of Egypt. To which Moses probably said something to the effect of, you're shitting me, right? And God was like, nope, so make sure you put a big red cross on your door so I know not to kill you and your family, because of course an omniscient, all-knowing God needs some kind of visual cue to make sure he passes over the right house.
I know that nowadays Alex would understand and appreciate that this is all a prefiguration of Jesus Christ. I get that he now understands that, so it kind of feels a little bit redundant to point this out. But yeah, obviously the point is not that God needs this because he needs to know you're doing this, but rather you need to engage in this act of faith. You need to trust in the blood of the Lamb to save you, and by having that trust, God is going to pass over you. And that's exactly how salvation works today, because fun fact, people have always been getting saved the exact same way.
Did anybody actually proofread this? But anyway, that night God delivered on his promise, killing all of the firstborns in the land of Egypt, even the animals, except for of course the Israelites, who remembered to put a big red cross on their doors.
Yeah, I should say, like, obviously with the, killing the firstborn of Egypt, the reality is it's pretty unimportant, just because obviously, as we all know, every single person who has ever died in the history of all humanity died because of God, right? God is the person who created the universe. God created the entire idea of death. So actually, if someone dies because God kills them directly, it doesn't really matter. It's just like we all understand, if you're a Christian, that if you die of a heart attack or whatever, that sucks. But we don't then say, well, that's God being evil, because of course, I mean, if you're a Christian, that's God bringing you home. It's not a bad thing, whatever. And then of course there's also the fact that this idea of individualism is bad, and instead we need to understand that when you have a corruption in society, that society affects everyone. And that's why, it's not as if every single firstborn was immediately or individually responsible for the bad things in Egypt. But yeah, that's the reality. When you have a problem in your society, you can't just say, well, as long as it doesn't affect me, that's fine, as long as it's just my neighbor, whatever. No, we should all be invested in our society. So if our society is doing something that places us in contravention of God's will, then we should all be worried.
Because God passed over their households.
Yeah.
And if that sounds familiar, well, that's where the Jewish feast of Passover comes from, an annual celebration of...
I do like how it shows, just zooms in. This is one of those things where, nowadays, with the way things are recently, you're like, oh yeah, anti-Semitism. Yeah, it's obviously zoom in on the fact that President Obama, who was not Jewish, didn't need to be Jewish, oh look, he's celebrating Passover. It's kind of funny, right? I mean, it genuinely seems like this is a wink wink nudge nudge, oh look who's kissing the wall situation, because you could just show a Jewish family, an actual Jewish family doing this, but instead you choose to show the non-Jewish, arguably, well, let's say on paper, most powerful person in the most powerful country in the world engaging in this Jewish celebration. I don't know, Alex, what are you trying to imply?
When God passed over the Israelites, in one of the most fatal genocides ever recorded. So there's that. Now after this happens, God must have changed his mind, because the Pharaoh then says to Moses, okay, go and serve your God, Jesus, if it means that much to you. So Moses and the Israelites head off out of Egypt, and things are looking good. But of course, those nifty little Jews aren't actually going on a 3-day vacation. They're making...
Yeah, those sneaky Jews. Like, sneaky Jews are there, sneaky Obama. Sorry, everybody. I not only lost into... Well, so basically, usually, it will be a situation where I knock a wire or something, and basically I kind of just, like, temporarily make it so my internet, like, disconnects. That time, I actually lost the internet entirely, and I was thinking, is this going to be a situation where it's down for, like, hours? But no, it came back. Well done, me. Yeah, let's proceed, I guess.
Killing them all. Again, very convenient timing before the 6th commandment had been issued. And so this is where the body of...
Okay, yeah, cool. Whatever. So basically, story there is that the Pharaoh gets killed. Again, we've kind of covered everything that matters here. It's about, like, nations can be punished collectively. Sometimes it is okay to kill people if it's like a punishment. There's all sorts of reasons why it can be okay. That's life. That's what all the people say. Riding high in April, knocked down in May. But you know I'm gonna change that tune when I'm back on top in June.
The Old Testament effectively began. Now, the most important thing that we can do at the end of any Bible study is look at the moral teachings that we've learned from studying the Bible. So what did you learn today, kids? Well, if you've been paying attention, then you should have learned that firstly, God so loved the Jews that he was willing to harden the heart of the Pharaoh and then fatally punish the Pharaoh for having a hardened heart. Secondly, you should have learned that mass genocide is sometimes okay. But anyway, that concludes today's Bible study session. You can find me on social media here. Don't forget...
Yeah, so Facebook.com. Oh my goodness, Facebook site. Here's my Facebook page, everyone. So yeah, basically there are like actual, obviously, what are the key moral takeaways from the story of Exodus? I think one of them is that obviously God chose the Jews as his chosen people, and we need to understand that in light of the overall message, which is about God's faithfulness and their lack of faithfulness, you could say faithlessness, that when you understand that God was so ride or die for the Israelites, that was all well and good until he actually died. That's the problem with being ride or die, right? He's ride or die, and then what happened? They killed him. So that's a problem. That's why that little Passover celebration, it's not doing them any good anymore, because they deny the actual salvation it was prefiguring. With that said, obviously that's the other message. We have to understand this shows how if you put your trust in a promise from God that is sealed with blood, then that will be evidence as effective when everyone else is perishing around you and you are saved. That's important. And then, of course, there's the fact that we need to understand, like I already said, that you can't just say, well, you know, my community do be like it is, but I'm just going to ignore it, because actually, you know, we're all in this together, something, da-da-da. While the ink of the covenant was still wet, the Israelites had already violated it, or something. Yes, indeedy-o.
To subscribe.
Anyway, moving on to the next video. This is why I had to line up 3, because we're not even a third of the way through the live stream time.
Watching, and I will see you after I get a haircut.
I really want to, like, use nail clippers to remove this ulcer. It sucks. I will.
Have you ever noticed that there's a stunning correlation?
Okay, so this is it. Okay. This is the one that's not about religion. It's also just a short one. It's not about the Bible. It's a short one. It's a Muslim. In fact, this is Iran in the background. Alex, sorry, I didn't realize I was watching imperialist propaganda slop. Yeah, this is one that's about religion. By the way, joking Jingling Jonkler, I can't believe you're the only person here. No one else has said anything. I can't believe you're my only I'm really embarrassing for everyone else. I'm I'm actually surprised. I always thought like the Alex O'Connor, I thought he brought in the big views, but clearly not right now. Not amongst my chatters, at least. Thankers. That's so steamy. What was I going to say? Yeah, okay, so this is not about the Bible. This is about religion in general. But it's a short video. It's one of a few short videos Alex O'Connor made, so yeah, let's go.
Between a person's place of birth and their religious affiliation.
Okay, wait.
Have you ever noticed that there's a stunning correlation between a person's place of birth and their religious affiliation?
So this is a bad argument, because obviously the correlation is not that stunning, or rather it is stunning, but in a way which makes religion seem more credible. When you realize, and I've said this before, if you're going to say, whoa, Rom510, Michael, you were born in England, so isn't it coincidental you're a Christian? No, if I was born in England, I should have been an Anglo-Saxon pagan. Or maybe a Druidic pagan, if we're going to pretend that the Germanic invasions wouldn't have happened for some reason. The reality is that Christianity has spread to so much of the world that actually to say that, oh, well, it's just because you happen to live in North America or South America or Europe or Africa or Australasia, that's why you're a Christian. It's like, well, okay, so basically the vast majority of people, like, that's the thing, right? It doesn't make sense. This would make sense as a criticism if it was like every little individual country had their own specific religions, but that's not how it works. Actually, you see that a lot of the time entire countries throughout history have become en masse members of a specific religion. And that tells you that people can have their minds changed on this stuff, and thus it's not just about being born into a certain culture.
Have you ever noticed that there's a stunning correlation between someone's parents' religious beliefs and their own?
Yeah, I mean, in general, people are likely to believe what their parents say. That doesn't make it wrong.
I can't count the amount of times that upon asking a theist why they subscribe to
I don't want to hold up the whole chat, but low-key, nobody wants to yap, not even to make low IQ points. Yeah, I don't know, Maybe the chat is more active when I'm doing more sectarian stuff. Like, dunking on the Catholics. Who knows?
a particular religion.
Of course, I don't usually stream on Tuesdays. Usually I either stream on Friday, Saturday, or Monday, and I reliably stream on Mondays. Maybe people are so confused why I didn't stream on Monday that they're now confused that I'm streaming on Tuesday.
That I've been met with the response of, well, that's just because I was born into it. It's amazing how oftentimes religious people can so effortlessly point out the
went mute for a second. Is that me went mute for a second? That's unfortunate. I wonder why. Well, I'm not going to try and find out where it is I went mute. Well, let me check. I want to know. If this feeling goes both ways. So I feel sorry for people with the name Al. Usually I have a stream on Friday, Saturday, or Monday, and I reliably stream on Mondays. Maybe people are so confused why I didn't stream on Monday that they're now confused that I'm streaming on Tuesday.
That I've been met with the response of, well, that's just because I was
the Monday doing more maybe. But low-key, nobody wants to yap, not even make low IQ points. Yeah, I don't know, maybe. Oh, is it you who went mute? Do you just mean that you're saying like the chat's not? Oh, whatever. Anyway, I will just proceed because
flaws in the doctrines of others, yet fail entirely to apply precisely the same.
This is really interesting. So Jesus or something, but this is a show which is all about like challenging, like comparing different religions. And I would say, isn't that like a good thing to be doing? Doesn't that show these people are actually taking seriously the claims of other religions? Sorry, I went back. Wait, let me
out the flaws into it. It's amazing how oftentimes religious people can so effortlessly point out the flaws in the doctrines of others, yet fail entirely to apply precisely the same rudimentary critical thinking to their own faith.
No, here's the thing though, right? I don't see anyone making really good... Okay, so let's just keep it simple. I don't see any Muslims making really good criticisms of Christianity. I would like to know, like, has Alex seen Muslims who make really good criticisms of Christianity? I imagine the only ones he would kind of like would be the ones that they basically just borrow from Bart Ehrman about, like, oh, you know, the idea of Jesus as divine kind of evolved over time. But even then, like, Bart Ehrman does not take seriously the whole Islam thing at all. And the flip side is, you know, the arguments that Christians make against Islam, they're really hard hitting. So I just don't buy this idea that like, oh, Christianity, like all these different religions are all really good at criticizing each other, but not very good at criticizing themselves. It's like, actually, it seems to me like Christianity is really good at criticizing other religions. I've not seen any other religions that are particularly good at criticizing Christianity at all. And I would also say, actually, Christianity is maybe the best religion at criticizing Christianity. Like, Christians seem to be much better at finding issues with their own religion in terms of like stuff they have to work out, far more so than I've ever seen any other religious group be able to do so.
I used to respond to this assertion by trying to point out that it's a logical fallacy and that surely they can see that their faith is so obviously completely dependent upon their geography. But it never seems to get through. Why is this? Why are so many religious people so insular and dedicated, despite knowing that they only believe in their arbitrary God because they were canalized into doing so?
Again, like in my case, this literally isn't true. My parents were atheists, but you know, it obviously, the thing is, I hate falling back on that, because the reality is I know that my children will be raised to be Christian, and in their case, obviously, it will be true. That's the ultimate reason. But again, Christianity is still a correct religion. The problem is that there's always going to be some people who were born into a certain belief, and that belief might be true. If there is one true religion, well, the chances are there's going to be some people who were born into it, and those people, well, lucky them. That's all there is to it, right?
Well, if you ask me, I think it's attributable to the unwarranted privilege that religion is so often granted in public discourse.
Islam's criticism of Christianity feels like very weak human reasoning. Like, I've heard Muslims complain Jesus had bowel movements and that's gross, so he can't be God. Yeah, that's it. Like, ultimately, and also I think like Muslims, they don't really understand Christianity. I don't know many Muslims who understand Christianity. Obviously, I've been doing my little Ramadan series, and the penultimate video is kind of about the Trinity again, and in it I sort of attribute to Muslims an objection to the idea of the Trinity as God being three distinct persons but still one divine being. And as I was saying that, I was like, I mean, to be honest, I'm giving Muslims too much credit there, because I don't think most Muslims are actually familiar with what the language of the Trinity is in terms of God being three distinct persons and one being.
Okay, you can satirize and criticize someone's politics, and that's just a diversity of opinion. But God forbid you do the same thing for someone's religious beliefs, because, well, then you're just a bigot. I mean, how many times has someone been called a racist simply for voicing an opposition to the teachings of Islam?
Yeah, I mean, whatever, like that, they do be like that. Hello, Daniel Booth. In my church, there are many, many people who come from a non-religious background. Yeah, I mean, my church, a lot of people also, come from a non-religious background, especially younger men, especially.
If a Christian is asked why they believe in their God and they say, well, it's just because they were brought up to, or they derive comfort from it, or they just feel as though it's right, well, that's perfectly acceptable. Why should anybody need to justify their beliefs? This is almost something I can get behind, but let's not forget that it's these beliefs which are infiltrating the politics of the masses and the education of children. If you want to argue that your religion should be taught in schools, and that scientific evidence should be ignored in favour of ancient superstition, well then I'm sorry, but you're going to have to do a little better than that.
Yeah, I mean, so for me, it's really simple. I would say that it's not even true to say that religion should be taught in schools. Rather, I think the evidence for religion should be taught in schools. So I'm not saying that people should just learn in school, Christianity is correct, Christianity is correct, Christianity is correct. Instead, I think there should be lessons on, here are the logical arguments for God. Here are the kind of scriptural. Here's the kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm trying to come up with a word that basically just combines textual, historico-textual. There we go. I just made up that phrase. Studies into the Bible that show why that's very credible. That's how I think it should be.
Imagine if Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump were asked why they...
A lot of my church was raised Catholic, which atheists might consider Christianity, but even then it's pretty radical change. No, yeah, exactly. And yeah, because that's the thing. There's a guy at my church who he was talking. So there's some new people who've come to my church, and they are atheists. Well, irreligious, whatever. And this guy, who's an older guy at my church, was talking to them, and he was kind of saying, yeah, I was raised Catholic, and he was kind of saying, and like yeah, same, well, basically, you were raised atheist, I was raised Catholic, same thing, because we've both actually gone through pretty much the same journey of now actually arriving at believing in the gospel. And I thought that was kind of funny, because from their perspective, like, as atheists who are just quite new to Christianity, that probably sounds like a very weird parallel for someone to be drawing.
They support a particular policy, and their response was that they were just brought up to, or they derive comfort from it, or just feel as though it's right. Would that be sufficient to anyone? Now, of course, if people keep their religions to themselves, then they shouldn't necessarily be expected to justify their reasoning. That's not what I'm trying to argue. I just wish that people wanted to. I wish that we could live in an educational environment which promotes skepticism and freedom of thought.
I mean, part of the issue is, like, a lot of people aren't really religious, right? Like, they say they're religious, but then their reasons make it pretty obvious that they don't even care to look into what their religious text says. They don't even care to justify their specific theological beliefs, or even have specific theological beliefs, or even maintain the basic degree of orthodoxy that their religion on every single doxastic level ought to demand of them. And in that context, you're like, wow, for a lot of people, like, religion is like a football team. I mean, the classic example, right, is Northern Ireland. Why is it that if you are, so also Glasgow, right? In Glasgow, it's literally, if you are on one, like, basically, if you're a left-wing person who came from Ireland and you are Catholic, then you support the Celtics. Is it Celtics or Celtics? Celtics. If you are a Protestant who's a right-wing conservative and you come from, like, Scotland or England, then you support Rangers. That's how it works. That's how it is in the entire city of Glasgow. And obviously that's really stupid, right? Because you can have those, like, none of those opinions should need to line up. But yeah, obviously in Northern Ireland, it's if you identify yourself as Irish, then you would be Catholic. And if you identify yourself as British, then, yeah, of course, it's St. Patrick's Day, how fortuitous, then you would be Protestant. It's like, well, obviously that precludes the possibility of either side actually thinking about their faith critically. Because if you think about your faith critically, you'd realize, well, why would it be the case that all of the specific doctrines of Catholicism would be actually true just based on how you identify yourself relative to certain national categorizations? That's just completely absurd. Hence why faith alone gets compromised on so much. Yeah, absolutely.
One in which no ideology is held beyond the ability to criticize. One which expels bad ideas and promotes no particular religious dogma and teaches children that, yes, your beliefs are probably just fine, but guess what? So are other people's.
Well, that's cringe. Saying, like, everyone's beliefs are just fine, that's, I think, stupid. I think that, like, my position is that I don't think that having a secular society is a good idea, because that requires this, it basically reinforces this idea that all religion is basically the same, that religion is just this, like, personal fashion accessory thing. And obviously that's part of a wider postmodernism where we act like ultimate truth isn't something that actually matters.
Universal reality, albeit quite a quixotic one, but don't you think that radicalization, religious authoritarianism and holy wars would all be a thing of the past? That's the thing.
Well, no, obviously, and this is really fun. Like, obviously, we recently responded to Alex O'Connor talking about atheist slogans that people should stop using. Obviously, this video is also much older, and you can even see his opinions evolve there because he shows footage of 9/11, and yet in a recent video, literally made fun of the simplicity of saying that religion is the reason why 9/11 happened.
Secularism.
Yes, exactly, Daniel. People would just fight over other things. That really is all there is to it, yeah. Especially since, again, a lot of the time, religion is just a substitute for other things. If you took religion out of the Northern Irish conflict, there would still be just as much conflict, because it's not actually about religion. It's about your national identity.
doesn't equate to atheism. Secularism benefits everybody. Yes, it protects my right to be an atheist, but it also protects my friend's right to be a Muslim. Secularism just means that each of these rights doesn't undermine or infringe upon other
Whoa, move to America, dude, if you want the US Bill of Rights.
rights. And that includes a child's right to a scientific education, or their right to abstain from pledging allegiance every morning to a god that they don't believe in. The
Pledge
founding
allegiance
fathers
to
of the
flag.
United States were strictly secular. Okay, we hear so often that the country was founded on Christian values, despite John Adams himself once stating that the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. As noted in an article from the Huffington Post...
Yeah, look, I don't care about, defending what America was founded on, because word on the street is America was founded on the, I think, absolutely horrible idea of not being British. I mean, that's just a terrible idea. Why would you not want to be part of the best civilization on Earth?
On the issue. The Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the Federalist Papers, and the Constitution, the four most important documents in American history, all unambiguously prove the country's secular origins. The Founding Fathers were completely aware of the dangers associated with a religious state, which is why they were so explicit in trying to prevent it. But despite this, every single president of the United States has been a Christian, save Jefferson and Lincoln, but even they were religiously ambiguous, so they could, in theory, still fit the bill.
You know what's crazy is, like, a whole load of prime ministers of Japan have been Christian. Also, we've had Benjamin Disraeli, shockingly, if you can't guess that name, Jewish prime minister. Isn't that crazy?
Look at the division that exists in modern society. Look at the scientific illiteracy of our children. Look at the influence of a Christian God upon a constitutionally secular state. And then look me in the eye and tell me that we don't need secularism now more than ever.
Well, again, the problem is that the US tried secularism, and they still ended up being super Christian, right? So that's my problem with the First Amendment of the United States. Basically, as soon as you put something into law, you automatically end up making people start trying to come up with ways to get around it. And that always creates it creates more problems than I think if you just say, you know what, we'll just try and make it up as we go along. They were worried about the state subjugating the church. Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, and that would be... Because especially if you understand that America wasn't founded necessarily when it was legally declared independent, but rather was founded upon a culture that started with English Puritans moving over, then I think that's why it would make sense to say America actually was a Christian nation. Because even though it might have been founded by a bunch of elites who said, oh yeah, we're going to be secular, it was actually based on and founded upon a people who already lived there, and they were overwhelmingly religious. The Founding Fathers foresaw the Online Safety Act and said, we don't want any part in it. Well, of course, the funny thing about the Online Safety Act is it's supposed to be about stopping access to adult content, which is, legitimate as a goal. I think we can all agree. Yeah, I mean, honestly, like, weirdly, I'm going to be real here. I'm not actually that bothered by the Online Safety Act. Because I don't think it's affected me, and therefore I don't care. That's not quite true. But no, I'm just thinking, like, it seems to me like, for the most part, the Online Safety Act has kind of settled down. Because there was, like, a time where it seemed like it was going to affect it. Like, I remember seeing articles like, oh, this is going to make it so you can't do all sorts of things. Like, it's not just going to be limited to pornographic content. But now it does seem like it is just limited to that. Like, I haven't encountered any situation where it's been like, yeah, you need to prove your identity or anything like that. So in that sense, honestly, I don't hate the Online Safety Act. But of course, what I am not very fond of is there are several big ways that the British government is right now going way too far. And I should say this, not gonna lie, Keir Starmer's crazy. I don't know if you're not American. Sorry, if you're not British, right? If you're not American. If you're not British, you might not know about this. This is a really crazy thing that happened. So Keir Starmer has twice, very autocratically, torpedoed politicians in local races because he's been worried that they were getting too popular. So I think this happened in somewhere in Essex. There was this guy who was like really popular. He was polling really well. And then he got a message from the Labour higher up saying, hey, we're getting rid of you and not letting you stand. But the big one recently is Andy Burnham is a quite popular politician in the UK. And he could very credibly challenge Keir Starmer. But he was a mayor recently. And in order to become the leader of a party in the UK, you have to be a member of parliament, or at least a leader of the major parties. You have to be a member of parliament. Obviously, the smaller parties that don't even have any parliamentary representation, that would be a stupid rule to have. But yeah, in the case of the major parties, you have to be a member of parliament in order to be eligible to be leader. So Andy Burnham was mayor of Manchester. I think mayor of Manchester. I might be wrong about the exact title. And there was a constituency in Manchester that he could have ran to be the member of parliament of. He would have been very popular. He probably would have won. But he was blocked from being able to stand in that constituency. They wouldn't let him do it. And that's like the crazy, like that's kind of the, I know Keir Starmer, he seems very pathetic. I think a lot of people kind of, I don't know, maybe don't view him as a threat. But genuinely, like his tendency to actively sabotage other people and consistently put, because a lot of people talk about like party over country or country over party. And I've heard like this is a phrase politicians use. I don't know if it's used in America too. People say I'm gonna do an American accent for no reason, but we're gonna put the country over the party. Yeah, well done us. Keir Starmer is literally it's himself over everything. Like he genuinely gives the vibe that there is nothing he wouldn't sacrifice in the country or even his own party's political, well, maybe I'm phrasing that wrong around, his own party's political fortunes or even the entire country. There is nothing he wouldn't sacrifice to maintain his own position of power. So I think he's potentially a very dangerous man, and I'm concerned about him more so than I've ever been of any prime minister in my lifetime or possibly ever in the history of the UK. So but yeah, Online Safety Act is maybe like that's the thing. For another politician, be like, oh, that's a pretty big step. But for Keir Starmer, no, that's just par for the course. This is just the kind of thing he does. He's a crazy autocratic tyrant.
I may be an atheist, but I'm a secularist before I'm an atheist. Okay, I don't want to force kids to abandon their religion. I just want to create an environment in which they can choose to make that decision for themselves. I'm Alex O'Connor, and thanks for listening.
I'm Alex O'Connor, and I approve this message. Okay. So we're actually like very much ahead of schedule. So I'm going to load up the next video, which is more recent and longer, but not much longer. It's still only 10 minutes. So
one card, two ways to pay.
Somebody said, oh, you should get YouTube Premium because it's worth it because you won't get ads. So this is a clip from his debate with Dinesh D'Souza. I don't know if Dinesh D'Souza is an idiot. I'm not sure. But yeah, someone said you should get YouTube Premium because, and I hear people say YouTube Premium is worth it. I don't know. Wait, I'm going to get some more water. I'm really thirsty. I have no idea why I've been so thirsty recently. I don't have diabetes. Just ignore me. I'm checking something. I thought I had really sorry I was gone. I hope you'll forgive me. That's interesting. I feel YouTube Premium is worth it if you also use it as a music streaming service. Yes. I think that was, yeah. Actually, if I did get YouTube Premium, I would use it for music. So do you also get YouTube Music as well? Because I do get recommended Spotify Premium sometimes, and I think, oh, maybe that would be convenient. No ads, blah, blah, blah. Especially since the ads I get are like totally irrelevant to me. But yeah. What do you think about the new Restore Britain party? I don't know. I will say this. I don't think they're going to be as popular in real life as they are online. I feel like actually it's weird to me. I think the whole thing is kind of stupid because Reform were already shifting things kind of rightwards and more conservative on the Overton window. I get that some people who are further right weren't happy enough with the direction Reform were aiming to go, but it just seems dumb to me to not be like, considering Reform have never ever won, it seems dumb to me to split the vote prematurely. It's like, okay, because it's sort of like, obviously you could say, well, you know, people on the left split the vote, but that's because the major left-wing party, Labour, consistently win. So if you look at like the next one along, that would be the Greens. It would be very stupid for another major left-wing party to launch in opposition to the Greens, because the Greens have never even got into government. So why would you split the vote before they've even had a chance to succeed? I kind of feel like it's the same thing with Restore versus Reform. I'm kind of like, well, why wouldn't you just like actually, considering Reform have never had any success, I don't know why you tried to supplant them so prematurely. Anyway.
Some people said that I shouldn't do this debate with this question. It's kind of an impossible question. It's the kind of question that requires more of an explanation to ask than to answer, which is a little bit strange. So I thought, the Bible is not a book. It's a library, and like any good library, it contains an amalgamation of different genres. And so asking if the Bible is true, you might as well ask if the corpus of Shakespeare is true.
So the title of the video is Why I Don't Trust the Bible. So that should be what we get an answer to here. We'll see whether or not, let's see whether we actually still manage to finish with time to spare.
Sort of betrays a misunderstanding of how people interact with the text. So I thought, will Dinesh argue that the Bible is literally true, historically true, allegorically true, morally true, theologically true, metaphorically true? And I suppose the only thing for it is to sort of try each one on for size. So maybe beginning with Genesis, in an attempt clearly not at historicity, but rather allegory and metaphor, we can deal with one of our types of truth here. We're introduced to Adam and Eve, who are told in no uncertain terms by God not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You may begin to wonder why knowledge of good and evil is such a bad thing, but the thought is interrupted by the introduction of the serpent, who says to Eve, did God say that if you eat of the tree, then in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die?
Now, I don't know. So obviously he said that, you might wonder why knowledge of good and evil is a bad thing. And obviously that's not really an art. He's just saying you might wonder this. And I'm kind of thinking, should we be strict here? Should we just say, well, only if he makes an argument will we bother to actually respond. But I will just say regarding that, so I actually think this is a really underappreciated moral insight in the Bible. I don't know if there's any earlier book that's made this point, which is that you only become morally responsible for your actions once you understand the difference between good and evil. And that's pretty obviously what Genesis is getting at. So God's telling them, hey, if you do not know the difference between good and evil, then you're fine, right? Because basically you won't have any moral responsibility because you don't have to make the choice for yourself because you don't know to make the choice yourself. And the point is, by choosing to make and that's kind of in a way like if you imagine like the trees, right? They can eat of any tree in the garden, just not that one tree. Essentially what that's saying is they can choose to do anything because they don't know the difference, right? They don't know the difference between right and wrong, so everything's available to them except for the one choice. There's one choice where if they make that choice, then they are accountable for everything, and that one choice is the knowledge of good and evil. So it's like if they choose to walk around naked, that's fine. Because animals walk around naked. We don't think that's shameful or anything like that. But then, when they make the choice to eat the fruit of good and evil, now they know that they are choosing to walk around naked as people who have a sense of what's right and wrong. And that's when they get shame. That's when they think, oh, wait, no, I feel like I shouldn't be doing this. So it's really, it's this really interesting insight. And as for like, is it right or wrong? It's not necessarily, because obviously the way it's arguably presented in Genesis is that, oh, this was a really terrible thing they did. Obviously, in the long term, I think it's part of a redemptive plan God has. But yeah, I think it seems like the initial plan was for humans to just be like any other animal, God's favorite, but like any other animal, in the not having moral accountability. And by having that difference between so what 11MN says loss of innocence, and that seems to be basically it. And Joking says Paul talks about how the law brings wrath because in light of the law, our failure to uphold it is real. Yeah, exactly. So to me, that's really interesting. And even so, look, I understand some people might not be theistic evolution people, but if you look at this in light of theistic evolution, it's actually very interesting, right? Because one question that people might ask, and it's perhaps not the biggest objection, but one question people might ask is, well, how could it be that if human beings emerged from non-human animals, where was the point where they became human? And the answer of, well, when they ate the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, that actually is a very compelling answer to that question. And because, obviously we all understand that monkeys don't make choices between right and wrong. No one has ever morally judged a monkey. So if humans are related to monkeys, then, which of course is what Alex believes, then one question would be, well, when did they stop? Like, when did human beings become morally accountable for their actions? That's a question that Alex would have to answer. And again, the fruit of good and evil is a very reasonable answer to that specific question.
And Eve says yes. And the serpent says, well, that's not going to happen.
That's an interesting point. Okay, what says, or what? I think God would have allowed them to eat the fruit eventually when they matured enough in spiritual matters, and it wouldn't have caused such disaster. But that's just speculative. That is an interesting idea, that basically the original plan was for it to be a slow, almost like sanctification, a preemptive sanctification, if you like. Yeah, that's a possibility.
God just knows that if you eat of it, you'll become like him, knowing good and evil, and he doesn't want that. That's all. You're not going to die.
Okay. Cool.
So Eve famously takes the fruit, eats some, gives some to Adam, and what happens? Do they die in the day thereof? Some people say in a metaphorical sense, yes. We'll get to that in a second, but at least on the surface of it, no. What does happen? God tells us himself. He says, now the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and eat from the tree of life, lest he inherit eternal life. And with this, Adam...
And I think the logic there would be that without going through the justification, without going through the sanctification, without going through all of God's plan, you don't get eternal life prematurely. So basically, eternal life is something that is part of God's plan, which I guess kind of fits a bit with what was saying, right? Which is that now we've eaten of the fruit of good and evil, the knowledge thereof, we cannot just eat the fruit of eternal life. Rather, we have to kind of build up to it. There's a process of justification and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, maybe that would make sense. I don't know that spiritual death would be metaphorical death. Yeah, that's a good point. It's worth pointing out. Yeah, basically. Also, kind of the other way I phrased it is, I don't know, does this make sense? I've always thought like what it could also mean is the day you eat it, you will become mortal. So it doesn't necessarily mean you will die on the exact day, but you will become capable of death. I've always thought, like, doesn't that make sense as an interpretation? So he's not lying. He's saying, look, the day that you eat this, you will die. And then the day they ate that, it did become true that they will die. It just doesn't mean they didn't die on the day itself, But from that day forward, the clock was ticking.
Eve are banished from the Garden of Eden. So who's telling the truth here? This story is quite mystifying to me, and I'm not the first to point this out. There's actually an apocryphal gospel discovered near Nag Hammadi in Egypt.
Yeah, so kind of the point he's getting here is, well, it seems like the devil was the one who was telling the truth. But here's the thing, right? What a good liar does is they tell you the truth in a way that is technically accurate, but is missing key details. This is when, I don't know, for some reason it's just the first thing that enters my head. I don't know why, is Scar from The Lion King, where he's kind of like getting Simba to admit that he's guilty of killing the king. It's like, well, if it wasn't for you, the king would be alive, wouldn't he? And obviously, yeah, technically speaking, because the king died saving Simba, but it doesn't therefore follow that he murdered, because obviously the implication there is, oh, you murdered him. So it's kind of that thing where it's a technically true statement that you can agree with, but it is missing the point of what's being said, where it's technically true that God just says, oh, don't eat that because then you'll die. And the serpent says, oh, don't eat that because then you'll become like God. And then God's like, hey, you're not going to die immediately, but you're like God, and that's a problem. Technically, that means that in the strictest interpretation, the serpent makes the more true claim. But in a deeper interpretation, it is God who is speaking the truth. God is speaking a deeper truth, because God's saying that in becoming like God, because you now have that moral responsibility, but not being actually on the moral level of God, you now, due to your lack of holiness, have to be cast out of paradise and become mortal. You suffer spiritual death because you have become separated from God. Because obviously we all understand, God is perfectly holy, he cannot abide with sin. Human beings who were still sinful at that point now had moral culpability for their actions, thus they became unholy, they became not able to be in the presence of God, so they had to be ejected. That is technically contained within what the devil says, or again, maybe the serpent was the devil, but probably the serpent was the devil, says, oh no, you'll become like God, and that's why he's upset. But the way the devil says it is as if God's just going to be like jealous or something, like, oh, I don't want you to be like me because I'm great. When actually it's the opposite. God wanted them ultimately to be like him, but just not in this way where they rush it and they take this premature unintelligent decision.
In the 1940s, dated into around the 2nd or 3rd century, called the Testimony of Truth, a gospel that didn't make it into the New Testament, which identifies the serpent, interestingly, who's never called Satan in the text, by the way, identifies the serpent with Jesus. I don't know if I'd go quite that far, but it does seem that the sort of allegorical truth of the story leaves a lot to be desired. I'm told that maybe Adam and Eve died a sort of spiritual death, or mortality entered the world. But then we need to...
Yeah, so obviously, just for a record, he says, like, didn't make it into the New Testament. Well, yeah, because it's stupid, right? The idea that the serpent is Jesus doesn't work at all, because God very clearly condemns the serpent. He says, oh, you've got, and obviously that's the weird thing, at this point prior to this, the serpent was presumably more like a lizard. He says, oh, now you have to crawl on the ground, blah, blah, blah. So it's one of those things where it's like, if you take, and again, it's kind of a similar thing if you just take this half-truth. If you take the fact of, well, wasn't the serpent kind of the one telling the truth? Doesn't that mean the serpent could have been a good guy? Yeah, until you pay attention to all the other stuff. Again, it's like the people who say, well, wasn't Judas betraying Jesus kind of necessary for God's plan? Doesn't that make Judas kind of the good guy? It's like, yeah, until you ignore all the other terrible things Judas was doing on the side. That's the issue. Oh, by the way, he's about to respond to the thing I was saying. Like, well, this is when they become mortal. So let's see what he says here.
To ask why it is that God had to proactively banish them from the Garden of Eden. This isn't some natural result of sin that, mortality entered the world. They're banished. And the implication is that they could have just as easily reached out and eaten from the tree of life, but God didn't want this to happen.
Okay, yeah. So I think I've kind of already covered this, right? Basically, it's the case of God being perfectly holy. He couldn't abide with sin, and obviously human beings became morally culpable with this. I basically already covered this, and he didn't want them to just be able to eat the tree of life because actually, now that they're not holy, they do have to be separate from God. They have to go through this redemption, which is what the entire Bible is about.
So he guards the gates of Eden.
And by the way, I will say this right now, just like talking this through, even just some of the stuff, because like I kind of obviously had a lot of this kind of in my head, although God willing, I'm being a little bit led by the Spirit on some of these points to just bring these words to mind as these points are being made. But I think I also had a lot of this in the recess of my mind. I also think that idea brought up by Watt about that God, basically they had to spiritually mature. I think that's also quite an edifying notion. I had all these ideas in my head, but talking them through has actually made me more confident in the Bible actually being divine, because seeing all of this as, oh wait, no, this is setting stuff up. I saw this thing, something I always talk about the Bible is, it's so intricate, it's so well written, it's so, like, all of these things are building on top of each other, even though they're written by multiple different human authors. Isn't it strange? But I saw this thing from someone saying, the reason why George R.R. Martin is not releasing The Winds of Winter is because he's going back and rewriting all the previous books in the series, because he's realized, like, some of what he said in the previous, like, basically, having now been working on The Winds of Winter, he's realized some of what he set up earlier doesn't really work, and he's kind of having to go back and rewrite the series, because apparently there's a quote from George R.R. Martin where he says that there was this other author, I don't know who they were, but this other fantasy author wrote their entire book series from beginning to end before they published even the first installment. And he said, that would be a really good thing to do, because then you can kind of be like, okay, I've written this and I've set everything up, and now I know where it's going from here. And that just shows that even when you're just dealing with one author, this ability to set things up and then deliver on them later on is very difficult to pull off. But when you just talk, even just about the very first book of the Bible, Genesis, and even just the very first few chapters of Genesis, and you then think of all of this in light of it leading up to this redemptive journey through, Israel's covenant and obviously the new covenant and Jesus, and you think about that in your life as a sinner who's been redeemed, who's been saved by trusting in Jesus, and you realize how many prefigurations of that and shadows of that, and just kind of setting up the logic of it that you see in Genesis. So much of this logic, if you apply the logic of Christianity to Genesis, it makes sense. This is something which you don't even see in the vast majority of works produced by single human authors. To say that this just happened to come about naturally when you had dozens of authors writing over hundreds of years makes no sense at all. God evolved the serpent to cruel young earth creation debunked. Yeah, I don't know when. I don't really know what the evolution of snakes is even supposed to be. Did they evolve from lizards? I don't know. I'm kind of, because what I do know is that there's I think it's called a slow worm, and it for some reason it's a legless lizard. So there are some lizards that are considered lizards, but they don't have legs. I think it's something to do with like the length of the tail. So like basically it's to do with the way that the tail is defined and stuff like that. But that is really interesting to me.
With a cherubim with a flaming sword. I find this quite strange, and I'd like to know what Dinesh thinks of it. Moving on quickly.
Okay, so yeah, and then he just says, well, why is it they have this like flaming sword, this cherubim? I don't know, like, could it just be a visual representation? I'm not sure. It is a bit weird that the Garden of Eden seems to be established as a place on Earth. That's a bit of an open question, I think. Obviously, it's not criticism. It's just, it kind of makes you wonder.
Opposed to the events of the later Old Testament, skipping over Exodus, we're introduced to another form of truth that I want to potentially engage in, and that's the concept of moral truth. That's another one that I spoke about in the beginning just there, the concept of moral truth. When we look at some of the military conquests of the Old Testament, bear in mind that the Promised Land pledged to Abraham is not an empty plain. Its indigenous inhabitants had to be, shall we say, displaced by a series of military campaigns ordered by God and carried out by his prophets. Thus we have such commands as in Deuteronomy, chapter 20. When you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. sounds promising to start with. If they accept and open their gates, all the people in it shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. Some peace. If they refuse to make peace and engage you in battle, which, why would they do that on these terms? Lay siege to that city. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, put to the sword all the men in it. As for the women, the children, and the livestock, and everything else in the city, they get to go... hold on.
Plain? Shop now.
So obviously he's about to make a joke of saying that they get to go free, but obviously that wouldn't be good for them. Like if all the men in the city have been killed, it wouldn't be good for you if you then went free, because you would just starve.
You may take these as plunder for yourselves, that's
Yeah.
right. And you may use the plunder the Lord your God gives you from your enemies.
Yeah, okay, so let's talk about this. It's just, it's a classic thing. If you are going to even consider taking the Bible seriously, you should work, I think, on the assumption that these were deeply corrupt cultures that were probably universally practicing child sacrifice. Now, I think the evidence, I'm not exactly sure how strong the archaeological evidence is for this. I think it's been mentioned that there is some decent evidence of child sacrifice occurring at various points in Canaan, so-called at the time. But whatever. I think the fact that the Bible has this kind of motif of condemning child sacrifice, the fact that these cultures seem to be presented as so terrible, and also the fact that Israel becoming corrupt itself is presented as culminating in them committing child sacrifice, which you see in the Book of Kings during, the reign of, his name starts with M, right? I'm gonna look it up. I want to know. Who is the king in Judah when they start doing child sacrifices? Oh, Ahaz? I thought it was what? Oh, Manasseh. That's it, yeah. Yes, okay, cool. So Ahaz and Manasseh, cool. Manasseh. Isn't there another Manasseh? Manasseh. Or is it just one? Okay, 14 king. I thought there was another. Oh, tribal patriarch. That's it. Okay, I thought. Oh yeah, I was gonna say. I was like, isn't there more than one? Because isn't it Manasseh and Ephraim? Yeah. Okay, cool. Anyway, whatever. That was just me going off on a private thing. But yeah, to me, I should say for context, I always read this with a mind towards the fact these were cultures participating in human sacrifice. With that said, this idea of they have to, if they're going to do this peacefully, they have to become the servants. So one of the reasons for that is because you have to subjugate them. Otherwise, you've not really conquered that culture at all. Like at that point, what's even the point in them surrendering? If the point in them surrendering is just that then, all right, okay, you surrendered now, have fun, just go back to exactly how you were. Well, that's not really a surrender, is it? Like surrendering has to bring with it some kind of consequence. Otherwise, it's not actually a surrender. And yeah, the surrender is going to be being enslaved, because that's how you bring them out of their culture they're into right now and into a culture that is much better. Now, obviously, with the whole thing about the women and the children, well, at that point, having them as slaves, that's even more important, right? Because, again, like I already said, if you just leave them to fend for their own devices, just let them go free, they're all going to die because they're not going to have any working men. So that's not going to work. Now, as for the question of how do you... why is it that you kill all the men if they try to fight back? Well, again, there's also the standard thing of this probably didn't mean all the men, every single last one. That's the kind of thing where you're likely to see an exaggeration in the language. But yeah, at the same time, it's probably going to be a lot of them because that's how war was. In fact, like the fact they're fighting, yeah, obviously there's going to be a lot of men dying. But the other thing is, and I know this is an interesting factoid, which I can only cite a Lindy Beige video as my evidence for this, but apparently during the Bronze Age in particular, the vast majority of fatalities in combat happened after one side routed, which is to say abandoned the fight. And I think the reason for that is because, obviously if you've got a big shield, you can spend a long time defending yourself, and that means that if the other side, who's got a big shield and has been defending themselves, run away, you've got to take out as many of them as you can, because there's no point. I don't even know if it's honorable, but it's certainly not advantageous to just let them completely regroup, bring everything back together. No, like at the end of the day, I just don't think there's any real major issue with this as being reasonable conduct within the context of a war. And of course, the other thing is it makes it much less likely that the next city over is going to put up a resistance. So actually, in the long term, it saves lives. Which is saying, you can even talk about this in terms of Oliver Cromwell's conquest of Ireland. A lot of people say, Oliver Cromwell, again, St. Patrick's Day, Oliver Cromwell at Drogheda, he slaughtered the inhabitants. But yeah, that's the thing is, he said, if you surrender, then it's all Jeezy. But if you don't, like, if you make us have to do a costly siege, we're gonna make you pay the cost for that, so that other people know better. And it's just a thing that's always happened. Because if you just say, all right, you know what, you made us have to build a battering ram and just take the massive numbers of loss, because typically you lose more men in an assault than the defending side loses, because that's the whole point of fortifications, right? We're just going to go easy on you once we have to get... No, you kind of got to actually say, we've got to make it so the next side isn't going to do this. So all of this, I think, makes sense as rules of war in general. And then just add on top of that the fact that these were cultures that practiced human sacrifice that needed to be wiped out. That's your justification for the war, and perhaps your justification for, within the context of the war, being a little bit more brutal in terms of stamping the bad things out. Yes, context. Hello, Estevar Benito. The way I see it is, if you reject the Bible, there's no reason to assume interpretations that justify God's actions, but to make a moral critique, you have to make it as an internal critique. I think that's a very good way of putting it. Yeah, it has to be an internal critique, because otherwise you're just arguing against your own worst possible case. And because that's the thing, like, people will come up with all their ideas about how Israel was, but if you're just going to be working on your ideas, well, just work on your idea that God doesn't exist, and you can go from there. Sam Josh says, this feels like cope. The point is that slavery is wrong, though, not that slavery is a lesser evil than child sacrifice. No, slavery is not really wrong in any meaning. So slavery is not good for our society right now, but it's just a way of organizing labor, not really, in some sense, radically different from capitalism or feudalism or anything like that. Obviously, in capitalism, the way it works is that you have a class of people who own the means of production, and people then have to trade the value of their surplus labor in order to be employed to operate the means of production. And the capitalist class enriches themselves off the value of the surplus labor. In slavery, it's more direct. The owning class, which functionally is the capitalist class, but we wouldn't call them capitalists because it's not capitalism, they own the laborers directly, and they get the fruits of their labor in that sense much more directly. But of course, in some sense, slavery is better than capitalism, because obviously in capitalism, the capitalist class has no obligation to those who they're employing whatsoever, whereas under slavery, there is the fact that because you own that slave, you have a reason to try to take care of them, try to make sure that they don't die or anything like that. And then also, of course, there are rules that we see in the Old Testament about not mistreating them to an extreme degree. I'm American, sorry, I'm showing my colors. Yeah, obviously that's... So in America, slavery... I mean, the big problem with slavery in America is that, ironically enough, because they had these Christian values that incline them to think of slavery as this immoral thing, they had to, and obviously the reason why slavery is viewed as immoral within Christianity, because again, I say immoral, it's not immoral in the way murder is immoral. It's not immoral in the way adultery is immoral. It is a less than perfect way of organizing a society in contrast to some other ways of doing things. But obviously you see so the reason why I say this is because the main biblical indication that slavery is not the best possible system is in the book of, and I always pronounce this wrong, I think it's Philemon. I think it's how it should be pronounced. I think other people pronounce it weird. Philemon? I think Americans say Philemon. I think British say Philemon. But the problem is obviously a lot of the Bible people I listen to are Americans, so I always get confused which one I'm supposed to say. Whatever. Where, of course, Paul is basically saying, hey, Philemon, who's a slave owner, your former slave, Onesimus, is with me, and I'm sending him back to you because he shouldn't have ran away. But when he gets there, I think that you should accept him as not a slave, but as a brother instead. So I think you should give Onesimus his freedom, just between me and you. So that gives an indication that, hey, really as a Christian, you should probably set your slaves free. But at the same time, this isn't like how you would talk to someone who's a murderer, right? You wouldn't say, hey, I'm sending this guy to you, and I think you should probably not murder him. Like, if you can, just... So it's, I think, pretty obvious that the Bible says that slavery is not great, but it's not condemned as this absolutely horrendous... Because in reality, there's all sorts of societal contexts where slavery makes a lot of sense, whether it's punishing criminals in a world where you don't have prison, or punishing those who are debtors, in a world where you don't have sophisticated banking systems and all that kind of stuff, and ideas of insurance and all of that. Yeah, there's many reasons why ancient societies would have had slavery. But the reason why American slavery had a particular big problem with it is that I think because they had this idea of, well, slavery is not really good. You shouldn't be enslaving like your friends, your buddies. So we're going to have to come up with this system that says that black people are innately inferior and designed to be slaves and stuff like that, which of course is quite a unique feature of American and maybe more broadly kind of colonial slavery. But yeah, it's not great, I would say. Chattel slavery was very different. Yes, it was different, I would say. You almost seem to be acting like you're disagreeing with me. I don't know if I've necessarily... Okay, cool. So, yeah. But anyway, let's proceed.
Likewise, in 1 Samuel, we have the destruction of the Amalekites. There's the order, now go...
By the way, Sam Josh, so I've seen you before, right? I'm not... You're not new. I think I've seen you before.
Attack the Amalekites and totally...
welcome everyone who's shown up, by the way. I appreciate it. And of course, if you enjoyed the stream even remotely, then give it a like, and that would be appreciated.
Destroy all that belongs to them. I'm told sometimes that this is actually an exercise in hyperbole. God didn't mean everyone.
Huh?
It continues, do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. And if you think that this is hyperbole, consider what happens when Saul does conduct the destruction of the Amalekites as ordered, and decides to leave alive the king as well as some of the best of the livestock. He leaves them alive. For this small act of mercy, God responds by saying to the prophet Samuel, I regret that I have made Saul king because he...
Okay, cool. Wait, let me just...
He's turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions.
Cool. Okay, so I'd say there's like really 2 points to that. The first is, how can this be hyperbole when it's really making the point of stressing, no, you've got to kill everything? Well, the answer is that sometimes people do elaborate on their hyperboles. Like if someone says, I'm saying like we killed them, we absolutely murdered them, like we destroyed them. Like that's like they're elaborating, they're emphasizing the point, but it's still hyperbole. Indeed, sometimes emphasizing can indicate hyperbole further. So that's kind of, I guess, my response there. I think that the fact that he's saying, I don't know if we actually know who is supposed to have, what human author is supposed to have written the book of 1 Samuel. I'm not sure. Anyway, either way, whoever it is emphasizes the point. Oh, by the way, the thing I haven't even mentioned, of course, is that it is interesting that this is actually presented as coming from Samuel via God. So there's some people who say this specific thing is actually Samuel, not God. It's one of those weird situations where if that is the case, maybe it's a bit weird for me to be trying to justify it when it turns out, actually, no, that was Samuel saying that, but like the actual meaning there is he's kind of making stuff up in order to trip Saul up or something like that. I'm not sure. Whatever. I don't really think that's the case, but I've kind of heard people mention it. Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to work on the assumption it's actually coming from God. In which case, I think that point of, well, he says like, blah, 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 I'm really going to emphasize this. I don't think that disproves its hyperbole. That's all I can say there. And again, so there's lots of positive reasons to think it's, or think statements like this in the Bible are hyperbole. The main one people point to is the fact, the fact that you see this kind of language used all the time nowadays, and also used all the time in sources, in old sources. All the time we use language like all and everything and blah, blah, blah. And we don't literally mean all or everything. Because that's just the thing we do. It's the thing we've always done, so it makes sense you would see that in the Bible. And the other thing is you get more explicit confirmation of that when you see cities being described as everything was destroyed, and then later on you see those cities actually still inhabited, or you have a people group and they were all put to the sword, and then later on you see people from that people group showing up. So that suggests it's not all. So that said, the other point was, well, what about the fact that Saul brings this king back, and that's considered a problem? Doesn't this show that he must have actually meant all when he gives this command? Well, the issue is we have to understand what the hyperbole here is talking about. So my position is that there would have been a generalized no quarter bloodshed, where there would have been a period of somewhat indiscriminate killing of the inhabitants of a city, in keeping with how sieges historically go, again, to discourage sieges by making them costly to the cities that resist, whatever. But the point is that, one, there would not have been a concentrated effort to hunt down literally every single last person. And that includes both people fleeing the city and also people kind of hiding within the city. That there might have been a point where this just, this violence that would have happened in the immediate aftermath of the city falling would have just petered out without everyone being killed. But basically the point is, there is a mass killing, but there's just not this completist effort to kill literally every single person in the city. That's the point that needs to be stressed. With that said, what Saul is doing is very much not that. Because first of all, you have that Saul is clearly, because Alex says, oh, so-and-so, this act of mercy. But this is not an act of mercy from Saul. This is an act of pride. He's doing this because he wants to keep the best stuff to enrich himself. He wants to keep the king so that he can kind of show like, oh, look at how great I am, like basically to parade him around as a point of pride. Like, hey, look, I captured the king. The other thing is that, again, the issue here is with these cultures, with these societies, and the point is to basically commit a cultural genocide, but facilitated by a genuine mass murder, in order to stamp out these corrupt cultures. And with that said, the one thing you would definitely want to do is kill those who were in the position of authority in these cultures. So the fact that Saul is reprimanded for keeping the king alive doesn't contradict the fact that there might have been some other people who were allowed to be alive, because if there's one person who should have been killed, it would be the king, because the king is the person who directly speaks to a continuity of this power structure, of this societal order, and that is the thing that needs to be struck out against. Anyway, let me see Comments. The problem with the slavery critique is that depending on your general moral framework, you might completely disagree with me over what slavery even is. Yeah, that's a good point. The Amalekites literally attacked them later, so obviously they didn't kill all of them. Yeah, okay. I believe the Quakers were the main Christians force against slavery. I didn't know much about what makes them unique. I don't know much. Well, yeah, the Quakers are a little bit weird because the reason they're called Quakers is because, like an earthquake, they literally shake, they quake. So I think they're very like charismatic in a way that I would say is not appropriate. And obviously, I'm not going to get into all the issues with the charismatic movement here and now. Oh, I just realized. Sorry, I did not realize. Oh my goodness, sorry. I kind of was so used to the fact that we were making a lot of progress. I did not realize we were actually as late as we are into the thing. What's your streaming schedule? You're a tough man to pin down. So I typically start streaming at 8:45. I was about to say 20:45, which would be very military time of me. Although, by the way, obviously in America, it just occurred to me, people might be confused because America is currently, you had daylight savings time. You go into daylight savings time before we do over in the UK. And for that reason, it means things will be slightly out of sync compared to normal. But usually on this channel, it's either time zone, GMT, Greenwich Mean Time. Usually it will be Saturday or Monday, sometimes Friday or Monday if I'm doing something over the weekend. And this time I just happened to be doing something on Monday, which meant I'm doing it on Tuesday instead. But usually it would not be on Tuesday.
So not even the animals can escape this genocide. So I'd like to ask Dinesh, I suppose, directly, which is it? Is this a morally corrupt series of events, or do I have to dispel with my moral intuition that genocide, including of innocent children, is a bad thing? There's plenty more to talk about in that regard. I don't want to take up too much time. This isn't, of course, to mention the advocacy and explicit instructions around slavery in the Old Testament. Hopefully we can get onto those too, if we want to go down the moral path. But I think that the most natural interpretation of the question is the concept of historicity. The literal truth of the Bible, that is. This is where I think we have to move to the New Testament, because the genre of the Gospel seems to be historical biography, unlike the mythology of a book like the Psalms or Genesis or Job. And here there's a lot to talk about. We begin with the birth narratives. There are two birth narratives in the Gospels, in Matthew and Luke. Both give different accounts. Both have a genealogy of Jesus, for example, but the genealogies are different. I'm told this is because one records Mary's genealogy and one records Joseph's. You can do this if you like. It doesn't seem like the most natural reading of the text if you're not already predisposed to synchronize the accounts.
Sorry, my pause button didn't work. Yeah, I again, not just because I've realized that we're streaming a little bit, like we've already reached the point where I would usually finish streaming. I usually try and stream for an hour and a half, and I was completely not having realized that we've been streaming for as long as we had, and we still got half the video left. I don't really have too much I'm inclined to say about the whole historicity thing. I think that it's not something I've heard this explanation of it's, doing different accounts. It's not something I've personally looked into. That's all I'll say. There'll be other people I think could look into this much better than me.
Then we have, for example, the flight to Egypt, which is only recorded in Luke, which is difficult to reconcile with Matthew's account that they went to the temple in Jerusalem instead. But more importantly, Matthew then says that the family traveled to Nazareth, and he says, "So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he shall be called a Nazarene," quoting the prophets. Now you'll notice if you read an online Bible that where the Old Testament...
So this is actually a very, I say very. The explanation here, which I think makes a lot of sense, is there's a part in the Bible where someone says, they say it to John, I think, or maybe John says it, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And I think the reasonable interpretation here is at the time, Nazareth was associated with all sorts of bad stuff. So to be a Nazarene was a bad thing to be. And that at the time, because the Bible does talk about the Messiah being humbled, being humiliated, being spat on, obviously you have the whole suffering servant, all that kind of stuff, that basically... this is Matthew saying this is fulfilling the point of the Old Testament that he'll come from like a humble, dishonored background, and he's, at the time, people understood this to be like those people from Nazareth. I think that makes sense.
Prophets are quoted. There's a little footnote telling you what the prophecy is. In this case, you won't find one, because the prophecy simply doesn't exist. It's not there. There's no such thing. So there are two options here.
Can't believe I go through the effort of becoming your only fan and still say America instead of American/Canada. Yeah. But the thing is, Canada's population is so, like, it's all just hugging the US border. So it means there's just a tiny strip of an American topping. Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Sam Josh. Keep up the great work. Your content and voice is needed. Godspeed, sir. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. And you are a hero.
Yeah. Either Matthew made up this prophecy or got it wrong, in which case the New Testament is mistaken, or the prophecy does exist, but for some reason fell out of our scriptural tradition and now no longer exists, which makes the accuracy and at least the completeness of the Old Testament suspect. So again, I'd like to ask directly which it is. Finally, I suppose I should mention the contradictions that a lot of people point to in the Gospels. Some of these, I think, are legitimate, some are not. I'll give you some examples very quickly of Gospel contradictions that I do think are real contradictions. First, the date of Jesus' crucifixion. Was it before the Passover, as John states, or was it after the Passover, as the Synoptic Gospels state? Second, Jesus is sending out his disciples to teach. In Mark, he tells them to take nothing with them except a staff.
So you want to start a business. You might think you need a team of people, and you need.
In Matthew and Luke, he says...
So, yeah, all of this stuff, I think it's going to be a bit too quick fire, and we don't really have time. So I think I am, as much as I don't entirely want to, I think I'm just going to ignore it. I will say, by the way, fun fact, we're approaching Easter. I am of the opinion that Jesus actually died on Wednesday. Because, well, whatever. There's a whole thing there. That's a real bombshell to drop. But there's, if you want to, you can look it up yourself. But basically, one of the things it really explains is when you look at because the Bible says, 3 days and 3 nights. I'm not crazy there. And the way Jews understood things was from sunset to sunrise was a night. Then from sunrise to sunset was a day. And technically speaking, the day actually begins at sunset. So I think, if he is crucified on Friday, then he rises Sunday morning, I think even before Sundays actually begin. So it's very difficult to have Jesus be crucified on Friday, die Friday. I guess maybe we're saying he dies before sunset. I don't even know if that's directly contradicted. Obviously, if Jesus Christ dies on Friday after sunset, and then he rises on Sunday before sunrise, and those are both possibilities, that would mean, according to the Jewish reckoning of time, he was only dead for 1 day. And even according to our understanding of time, we would say, well, as long as it happens before 12 p.m., as long as it happens before midnight on Friday, then that counts as a day. And as long as it happened after midnight on Saturday, that counts as another day. And then so that's 3. But that there's a way of reading the text which would actually have it be on Wednesday. And I think that makes a lot more sense, because it never really made sense to me that it's he dies, he's dead for 3 days. It's he's not dead for 3 days. No matter how you slice it, dying Friday evening and arising on Sunday morning, it doesn't really work. I'm trying to think, maybe it's a bit weird because I'm does Wednesday oversell it? I'm not sure. Anyway, whatever.
Take nothing with them, including no staff. So do they take a staff or do they not?
Oh, I don't mean to be rude, but does that matter? No, it doesn't. So this isn't something you're going to go to hell over or anything like that. the only sense in which it does matter is I have heard Muslims. I think what's his name? There's one Muslim in particular, Shabir Ali, as I think his name, who has brought this up as an objection to the crucifixion account. He's basically said the crucifixion account really doesn't make any sense because according to Jewish reckoning of time, it was not 3 days. Why would this Jewish prophecy for Jesus, who was a Jew, for his followers who was a Jew, why would it not cohere with the Jewish reckoning of time? I don't know.
Not a pedantic contradiction, but a contradiction nonetheless, and one that's led people like Barnabas Ahern to write entire articles on this. And Augustine himself actually distinguished between a literal staff and a metaphorical staff to explain this difference. Anything, I suppose, except considering the possibility of even the most minor of gospel contradictions. Third, Jesus flipping the tables at the temple. A famous story, but did you know that in the Gospel of John, this takes place at the beginning of Jesus' ministry? In the Synoptics, it takes place near the end. So when did that occur? Mary Magdalene, after the resurrection of Jesus, runs to the disciples in John's Gospel and says, "They've taken the Lord, and we do not know where they have put him." Strange thing for her to say if, as the Gospel of Matthew recounts, she's visited by an angel at the tomb who tells her exactly where Jesus is going, and then she's met by Jesus herself on the way to the disciples to bring them the news. Strange for her to then say that they've taken the Lord and we do not know where they've put him.
You know what? Okay, so I'm going to stop, because the reality is, like, I think I'm now at a point where I'm just realizing talking about all of these contradictions is going to be not really possible because it's so easy to wrap them all off. And the reality is at some point we're going to probably respond to an entire video about Bible contradictions. And to be honest, I would probably pre-watch. So usually I don't pre-watch videos because whatever, I don't know. I like the challenge. I will say at some point I'm probably going to do there's a few videos I've got on my little playlist of videos to respond to that are specifically about contradictions. And for that video, I'll probably pre-watch just so I can actually know exactly what's being spoken about and exactly what the responses are, because this is not a strong point for me, like this point of contradictions, all that kind of stuff. It's specifically contradictions in the historical accounting of events. When it comes to, like, if someone's going to say, oh, there's a contradiction between this verse that's talking about salvation by faith alone and this verse that seems to be talking about work salvation, or like basically something that points to a theological contradiction, usually I think I know most of those, and I can kind of say, well, no, this is actually how this is and this is how this one is, and that's something that I have prioritized. Or even then, if I was going to prioritize that, maybe I'd prioritize that more before I even considered looking at the question of, well, exactly how does the timeline of all this stuff in the Bible line up? That's not a priority for me, and that's not for lack of looking into the substance of the Bible. It's just there's a lot of substance to the Bible. With that said, it's not really something I can do on the fly. It's something I should do later. And rather than just sitting here and like being like, letting him continue to make these points and just be like, oh, I don't know. I think I might as well just go. I'd love responding to Bible contradictions video. Yeah, well, good in that case. I know Emma Thorne has a video on Emma Thorne. Is that her name? I think it is. Who I don't. Oh, actually, I think I have responded to her. Interestingly, she has a video on Bible contradictions. So yes. Anyway, I will see you all later. It's a little bit past my bedtime, so goodbye. I hope you all are having a wonderful, probably evening by now for everyone, unless you're in Australia, in which case, fun. Enjoy your day. Bye.